One of the most interesting things about the way the Jedi were handled in the post-Endor expanded universe leading up to the release of the prequels, to me at least, is just how little anyone knew what they were talking about. When the new Jedi Order series dealing with the war between the Yuuzhan Vong and the New Republic was being written, those books were coming out alongside the prequels, so the people responsible for writing the books were being introduced to George's final ideas for how the Jedi Order really had worked at the same time as the audience was. And we, as the readers, basically got to follow along with Luke learning about this lost information from various new information sources coming up in-universe, as that same information was being shown to us in The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, which released alongside some of the new Jedi Order books. And it meant some of the ways Luke was handling his new order came into conflict with what the original order had been, or the way they operated, which was handled in some pretty fun and interesting ways, at least I think, and which allowed for some contentious topics to be explored between the two orders, including one topic which turned out to be pretty prescient for how the rest of the Legends expanded universe would go. In the stories leading up to this point, Luke had met other members of the Old Order, and some of them even joined his. But because nobody knew what anything looked like, most of these characters suffered from mass amnesia, and they weren't the most helpful in providing specific information on how to structure things. For example, there's some stories where Luke's girlfriend Callista Ming was running around in her past life as a Jedi in the Old Jedi Order, spending time with Ahsoka, Luke's father's apprentice. But when those original stories were written featuring those characters, only the original trilogy and some notes from George existed on what things might have looked like. In particular, the idea of a central organization for the Jedi was less present. It was usually seen as a thing where the Jedi would go out in master-apprentice pairs, and then they'd kind of act independently in the galaxy. There was some belief, for example, that Yoda just hung out on Dagobah because that's what Yoda liked to do. This wasn't necessarily him hiding from the Empire in particular. The new Jedi Order series introduced things like Luke trying to reform the Jedi Council, which we had a much better idea of thanks to The Phantom Menace. And in the later parts of the series, another character stood in basically as a representative of the Old Order, providing a foil to Luke and his own ideas of what the Jedi and the Force were. This character was the long-lost Fosh Jedi Knight Vergere, who had been living with the Yuuzhan Vong until she helped Han and Leia's son, Jacen, escape from his own captivity, and considered herself to still be a representative of the Old Order. When she and Jacen escaped to the New Republic, she told Luke that she wasn't affiliated with his order or with the New Republic, that as long as she was alive, the Old Jedi Order and the Old Republic remained alive as well. It's worth noting, too, that she was conveniently taken away by the Yuuzhan Vong around the time of the Phantom Menace, meaning she would have general information about the Order that we, and more importantly Luke, needed to know, but she'd have an excuse for not knowing anything from Attack of the Clones or Vader's actual fall in Revenge of the Sith, since Attack of the Clones released only a few months before the novels she plays the biggest roles in, and which provide most of the context for this video, those books being Traitor by Matthew Stover and Destiny's Way by Walter John Williams. Revenge of the Sith wouldn't be out for several years after this point. This is kind of a small detail, but I think it's an underappreciated creative bit of framing to dodge some awkward information she might otherwise have been expected to have. And it gives her a kind of untainted perspective of the Jedi as they were before the fall. She's not really impacted by the events of the Clone Wars and the changes the Jedi underwent there, but we'll get back to that in a second. What isn't underappreciated is that today the channel hit 50,000 subscribers, which I am incredibly grateful for, so you can like and subscribe now to make me even more grateful. When you start a sentence with the words Vergere was, there's a significant number of people who will start uncontrollably vibrating, waiting to get mad at whatever you say next. But while later development of her character after her death would claim Vergere was actually a Sith, which is a whole other set of issues we won't get into today, but I will get to it someday, Traitor in Destiny's Way intended to portray her as that representative of a bygone era. And as a result, we get to see her as someone who did miss out on the Clone Wars, like I said, so she didn't understand the fall of the Jedi, the Emperor, and the early periods of Luke's Order. She had expected to get home during the Yuuzhan Vong War to the Order that she had left behind, and instead she found a pretty well-established version of Luke's Order. It still wasn't fully established, but it was definitely a far cry from Luke wandering around the galaxy trying to find random Force sensitives. She was also certainly shaped by her own circumstances and experiences, engaging in some pretty harsh teaching methods with Jacen and espousing some pretty different ideas about the Force, especially in Destiny's Way, but when it came to how the Jedi were as an institution, she was able to come in with knowledge nobody who talked to Luke really cared to mention before, which meant in Destiny's Way, the only Star Wars book written by Walter John Williams, she and Luke were able to have a few pretty interesting conversations, not just about the nature of the Force, and especially how it related to the Yuuzhan Vong, who were essentially invisible in the Force, and therefore seen by the Jedi of the day as a potential aberration or contradiction of their philosophy, but they were also able to discuss how the Jedi should operate, and this provided some key points of contention. There were two main points of contention for Vergere and how Luke was running his order, with one concerning her a lot more than the other. The first is that Destiny's Way took place in the middle of an election following the fall of Coruscant and the death of the prior Chief of State, Borsk Felia. Luke was still trying to get approval for the Jedi to form a new council, and this became a pretty major point of debate in the election, with the eventual winner, Cal Lomas, being the most friendly to the Jedi and advocating for the council's creation within the New Republic, while others opposed that, fearing what could happen if the Jedi gained too much power and another Darth Vader happened. Both sides of Luke and Vergere's debates on this centered on the idea that the Jedi did serve the republics of their respective days, and took for granted that they would in some way be answerable to the Chancellor, something which is kind of interesting given this core tenet becomes more widely questioned in Star Wars media after Episode 3 and the Clone Wars generally, where the Jedi becoming essentially political instruments is part of the problem, and Luke ends up more clearly divorcing the Jedi from any political body as time goes on. Luke does comment on this already in Destiny's Way, thinking about how the Jedi had become insular and only politically connected to the Chancellor, allowing Vader as the Chancellor's representative to destroy the Jedi. That's not entirely accurate to what happens, but again, this was years before Revenge of the Sith, so points for effort. But Vergere's particular complaint is that Luke becomes active not just within the government, but within the political campaign ongoing at the time. His political activism basically gets into partisan territory, although the circumstances of the Jedi's less established position makes their situation a bit more tumultuous. For Vergere's order, it was taken for granted that the Jedi should exist and the Order should exist within the Republic, with the Council existing as some kind of power within that institution. With the election that Luke's involved in, they make a joke that the Jedi are basically expected to just go out and get normal jobs like regular people, taking away any of the institutional power the Jedi might have had. Vergere expresses her direct displeasure at Luke's involvement with this new Chief of State, Cal Lomas, and Jason counters to her, alleging that the Jedi served the Chancellor in her time as well, without objection from Vergere to that fact. She does say, though, that, quote, "Chancellors came and went, and we served the Republic," end quote. She relents a bit when Jason points out Luke has served under 4 different chancellors, but Vergere is definitely concerned about the connection between the Jedi and political power, something which becomes even more apparent with her stronger objection to another part of Luke's order which seems to truly terrify her, the fact that they're able to marry and have space babies. A lot of the time, Jedi disallowing marriage and kids gets discussed in the context of the dark potential of attachments, and how they can cloud a Jedi's judgment, something which Vergere brings out against Jason, ridiculing how much his decision-making process is centering on his sister Jaina. But her biggest blow-up in the book, aside from when she does literally blow up, sacrificing herself at the Battle of Ebac 9 to save those siblings, comes when Luke is getting new baby pictures of his and Mara's son, Ben. Luke explains part of why marrying is allowed in his order is because he had to recruit much older people with established lives, leaving out the more meta reason that just nobody knew these were the rules when those books were written. But Vergere claims, to Luke and Mara's extreme objection, that their connection to their family makes them less than Jedi, questioning what they might do when they have to choose between duty and family. But even more important is the fact that Ben was as strong in the Force as his parents and his grandfather, Darth Vader. The Legends universe definitely went pretty hard in the direction of Force power being inherited, and Vergere decries the terrifying potential of Jedi dynasties being formed, passing their power down familial lines. Even though Luke usually comes across as more sympathetic here, and Vergere's motives were definitely in question given how she had tortured Jason in the name of teaching him, this is an era where the fears of the Old Order on what could happen in these situations aren't unfounded and kind of get borne out by the rest of the Legends expanded universe. Vergere, while kind of pompous throughout the book, usually ends up being pretty level-headed in her discussions with both Luke and Jason, even when they're kind of weirdly discussing Luke's ideas about how exterminating the Yuuzhan Vong may or may not have been a valid choice. And when she's given information which leads her to conclude that elements of the New Republic are actually planning to move forward with exterminating every Yuuzhan Vong, something she very much does not want to happen, it's this interaction with Luke on this difference of philosophy between the old and new Jedi Orders which gets her angry enough to get her the all-important italic text. This seems to be one of the most concerning things she sees in the book. Luke downplays the threat this can pose when they're so under fire by the Yuuzhan Vong, but ultimately there is an oligarchy which does go on in Star Wars, and Destiny's Way pretty accurately calls the shot of these Jedi dynasties taking a lot of political power by being involved in this way. These dynasties do come about just how Vergere says. Luke's direct line goes down to Cole Skywalker, remaining in control of the Jedi Order as a Grand Master, a role his son Ben probably did end up taking over. And before Han and Leia's son Anakin died, it was expected that this would probably have been his role as well. But on top of that, the thrones of the two major monarchies in the galaxy ended up being taken over by the descendants of Vader within a few decades. Jaina Solo, as the so-called Sword of the Jedi, married Jagged Fel, who was elected the Imperial Chief of State before becoming the Emperor, thereby making Jaina Solo Fel the new Empress of the Fel Empire, one generation removed from when her uncle decided that probably wouldn't be a very cool thing for him to be. Jacen also had a child with Tenel Ka-Jo, the Queen of the Hapens, and presumably this child, Alana, continued on that dynasty as queen along with her own descendants. By the time of the Legacy era, about 100 years later, Jaina's descendant, Empress Marasia Fel, was involved in the defeat of Darth Krayt's Sith Empire, and the Fels had been training their own branch of the Jedi, the Imperial Knights, who didn't have quite the same codes as the Jedi Order did. After the conflicts of this period, the Empire joined back up with the Galactic Federation, putting Marasia as one of the 3 members of the Triumvirate ruling the known galaxy, alongside Jedi Grand Master Kakruk and Commander of the Galactic Alliance's remaining forces, Gar Stazi. It's really not a great look for the idea that Jedi dynasties wouldn't be taking over rulership positions, because they 100% did. That's going to do it for our look today at these major fears for the old Jedi Order and how they related to Luke's order. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you have enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.